Hi guys, today we'll delve into the case of a young mother who was found in her own home under strange circumstances. Police began their investigation and quickly uncovered several alarming clues. But, despite this, they couldn't find enough evidence to solve the case, and it went cold. It was only nearly 60 years later, thanks to one phone call, they had an unexpected breakthrough, and the truth was finally revealed. Karen Snyder was born on July 29, 1948, in the small American town of Cedar Lake, Indiana. She grew up in a very large family with 2 brothers and 3 sisters. In high school, Karen met a boy named Paul, and they decided to get married when she was just 17. Shortly after, Karen became pregnant, and in 1966, their daughter, Paula, was born. Even though Karen was only 18 at the time, she and her husband were ready and happy to start their own family. They moved to a town called Calumet, Illinois, where Paul's parents lived. The family settled on the same street as his parents, just a few houses away, allowing them to see Paul every day and spend a lot of time with their granddaughter. Calumet City, with a population of about 25,000 residents, was located not far from Chicago and considered a very safe place to live. Karen spent most of her time taking care of their child, while Paul got a job at the local railroad. On November 12, 1966, Paul went to his night shift around 2 p.m. A few hours later, he tried to call Karen, but she didn't answer. This was unusual because she was supposed to be at home and couldn't have left their 2-month-old daughter alone. Concerned, he called his parents, who lived just a few houses away, and asked them to check on Karen. They walked down the street and knocked on the door, but there was no response. His parents didn't have a spare key, so they continued knocking for a few minutes and then went back home to call their son. Paul became even more worried and decided to leave work early to check if everything was all right. As he approached the house, his concern grew even more. The porch light was off and the blinds were tightly closed. This was unusual because Karen always left the porch light on for him when he worked the night shift. Paul tried to open the door with his key and realized it was unlocked. He entered the living room and was relieved to find his 2-month-old daughter sleeping in a playpen near the working TV. However, Karen was nowhere to be seen. So, he began calling out her name while checking each room. As Paul decided to go upstairs, he tried to turn on the staircase light, but the switch didn't work. He made his way to the bedroom and turned on a lamp, revealing a horrifying scene. The room was in disarray, and there was blood everywhere. On the floor lay Karen, showing no signs of life, and Paul immediately realized she was dead. Recovering from the shock, Paul went downstairs, called the police, and took his daughter outside. While he was waiting for the police and ambulance, his parents came out to the street and saw him crying and pleading for help. Paul's mother grabbed a flashlight and rushed into the house, hoping to help Karen. But as soon as she saw Karen's blood-covered body, she knew it was too late to save her. Soon after, the medics and police arrived. The doctors could only confirm Karen's death, and the investigators began examining the crime scene. On the back door lock, they found shallow scratches indicating an attempted break-in. However, the door was still locked, suggesting the intruder initially tried to enter this way but failed. Next, they discovered a broken basement window with a trail of blood leading from it to the front door. Investigators speculated that after failing to open the back door, the intruder tried to enter through the basement and cut themselves on the glass, evidenced by the blood on it. The fact that the intruder didn't enter through the basement but went to the front door suggests it was either unlocked or Karen opened it herself. In the living room, they found more blood, indicating that the attack likely started there, catching Karen near her daughter's crib. The blood trail continued from the living room up the stairs, down the hallway, and into the couple's bedroom, where Karen's body was found. The bedroom was a chaotic scene, blood everywhere, and many items scattered and broken, indicating Karen fought back fiercely. There was a phone in the bedroom, but it had been ripped from the wall. Police believe Karen might have run there ahead of the intruder to call for help, but she couldn't. In those days, there wasn't a single emergency number like 911. Local police had their own number, so detectives thought she might have dialed incorrectly in her haste. Investigators also found a blood-covered light bulb on the floor, which had been unscrewed from the socket above the stairs. It seemed the intruder did this, though the reason was unclear. Perhaps he unscrewed it while following Karen upstairs, giving her a brief moment to try calling the police. In the downstairs bathroom, police discovered a pile of bloodied clothes and various items. Among them were a pair of pants, a bedsheet, and a washcloth. Detectives speculated that the killer used these items to wipe the blood off his hands and clothes. It appeared he also attempted to clean himself with the washcloth, or possibly tried to use it to wipe blood off the floor to cover his tracks. However, given the amount of blood throughout the house, these efforts were clearly futile. After using these items, the killer threw them into the bathtub and fled the scene. This indicated to investigators that he remained in the house for some time after the murder, although they couldn't determine the exact period of time. Detectives began their investigation and quickly ruled out the possibility of a botched robbery. The only missing items were Karen's blue wallet, containing about $50, and one of the bedside lamps, which had no significant value. Medical examiners found 124 stab wounds on Karen's body, most concentrated in the chest area. Such brutality suggested the attacker had personal motives. Experts identified the likely weapon as a knife with a narrow blade similar to a stiletto, but police couldn't find it inside the house or anywhere nearby. Karen was fully clothed and no signs of sexual assault were found, but investigators didn't rule out that the attacker might have had such a motive, but for some reason was unable to carry it out. The time of death was estimated between 4 o'clock and 6 p.m. Since Paul discovered her body around 11 p.m., the killer must have left the house several hours earlier. Detectives began their investigation by speaking with the victim's relatives and friends. According to Paul's mother, Karen had mentioned being afraid to live in that house and said she wanted to move to Indiana where her parents lived. However, she didn't specify the reasons for her fear, and investigators couldn't find any more information. Karen's neighbors also provided an interesting observation. Their dog, which usually barked at the slightest noise, remained quiet that evening. With no other leads, the police turned their focus to Karen's husband. In such crimes, the spouse is often the primary suspect, so they began investigating him. After analyzing the evidence from the house, detectives concluded that the attempted break-in at the back door and the broken basement window might have been staged. The killer was likely someone familiar with Karen, but tried to make it appear as if a random intruder had committed the crime. This suggested that either Karen willingly opened the door to the killer, or they had a key. Investigators began interrogating Paul while also trying to establish whether he had the opportunity to commit the crime. They considered the possibility that he might have killed Karen before leaving for his evening shift, as he had left home after lunch that day. They also checked whether he remained at work for the entire shift, or if he had left at any point. Paul denied any involvement in the murder, but the police continued to view him as the prime suspect. With almost no evidence, they attempted to obtain a confession from him, repeatedly calling him in for questioning. But, despite this pressure, Paul consistently maintained his innocence. Karen's funeral took place 6 days after the murder. Besides family and friends, detectives also attended the ceremony and soon noticed something weird. One of the pallbearers had a deep wound on his forehead and a bandaged hand. The police identified this man as James Barbier, a friend of both Paul and Karen. He worked with Paul at the railroad and had done some repairs in the house shortly before the murder. Karen knew James pretty well and might have opened the door for him. Investigators began looking into James and discovered that on the evening of the murder, he had gone to a local hospital with serious injuries to his hand and face, requiring stitches. This aligned with the evidence suggesting the killer injured himself on broken basement window glass. James became the second suspect, and detectives brought him in for questioning. He denied any involvement in the murder, explaining his injuries by saying that he had been returning home drunk from a bar that evening, tripped over a stump in the dark, and hurt himself on some splinters. James' wife confirmed that he came home that night drunk, with a bandaged hand and a cut on his forehead. She mentioned that he was acting weird and was visibly shaken, but she added that James was an alcoholic and frequently got heavily drunk, so this behavior wasn't unusual. When police interviewed individuals who frequented bars in Karen's neighborhood, they found witnesses who had seen James there that day. However, they couldn't pinpoint the exact times he was present. When experts finished analyzing the evidence from Karen's house, they found something intriguing. As suspected, there were two different types of blood. One matched Karen's blood type, while the other belonged to a different blood type, the same as James's. Although this blood type match was not proof of James' guilt, detectives decided to arrest him, hoping he would confess. They also cleared Karen's husband of suspicion, as none of the blood samples matched his type. James continued to deny his involvement, insisting that his injuries were from his fall. The police hoped forensic experts might find some additional evidence, but they faced disappointment. The fingerprints collected from the crime scene were smudged, and without DNA analysis, they couldn't make any progress with the blood evidence. Eventually, they had to release James and continued searching for new leads. Since then, investigators have looked into several other suspects and interviewed dozens of people, but the case remained unsolved for many years. Karen's murder forever changed their small town, once considered safe. Residents remembered the brutal crime for a long time and wondered who could have committed it. At the time, police did not reveal the identities of the suspects, including James, so only Karen's relatives and close friends knew of his potential involvement. In later interviews with reporters, they said they truly believed James was guilty, but without solid evidence, proving his involvement was simply impossible. Karen's father passed away in 1973, 7 years after the tragedy, and her mother died in 1977. Neither of them ever found out who killed their daughter. Paul eventually remarried, and his second wife helped raise Paula, essentially becoming the mother the girl never had the chance to remember. Her relatives decided not to tell her how her biological mother died, trying to shield the girl from the horrific details. Paula later recalled that when she started school, other kids teased her simply because her mother was dead. A few years later, understanding that she might hear the truth from others or come across news reports, her relatives finally told her what had happened to Karen. In 1989, at the age of 45, Paul passed away from health problems, never learning the truth either. For decades, there was no progress on the case. Paula occasionally gave interviews to journalists, expressing her hope to bring the culprit to justice and mentioning that she regularly contacted the local police department to ask about any new developments. But they always replied that there were no new leads, and the case remained unsolved for many years. This continued until the end of 2022, when one day the police received a call. A 29-year-old man contacted the police department responsible for Karen's case, inquiring about any new developments. The man explained that he had known about this crime his whole life, as his grandmother talked about it since he was a kid. It turned out they were distant relatives of Karen's family, and the man was curious whether the police had made any progress in solving the mystery. He said that he had been reading newspaper clippings about the case at work and wondered if there were any modern technologies that could help solve it, and this prompted him to reach out to the police. To his surprise, the police department decided to reopen the investigation following his call. Naturally, none of the original detectives were still around, so a new team began reviewing all the available materials from scratch. They discovered that almost all the evidence, except the blood samples collected from the floor, had not only been preserved, but was also well maintained over the past 56 years. This included Karen's clothing and various items from her home. The detectives sent all the remaining evidence to the lab, where experts began examining each item with modern tools. Meanwhile, the police re-interviewed everyone connected to the case who was still alive. 16 months after the investigation was reopened, detectives received a long-awaited call from the lab. Experts had found several drops of blood on Karen's dress and extracted a DNA profile of an unknown male. The police immediately obtained a warrant from a judge to collect a genetic sample from the main suspect, James, who was still alive. They quickly got his sample, sent it to the lab, and soon received confirmation. James' DNA matched the blood found on Karen's dress. This confirmed that James, who was just 21 years old at the time of Karen's death, had been in her home the day she was murdered and had initially lied about how he got his injuries. On April 29, 2024, the police returned to James' home and the 79-year-old man was finally arrested for murder. Upon being informed of the DNA match, James did not deny anything and confessed to the crime. While the police have not yet disclosed all details of his interrogation due to the ongoing legal proceedings, James admitted that he had known his entire life that he would eventually be caught. James has been charged with first-degree murder and was released on bail due to his age and severe health conditions. Given James' state, the risk of him fleeing was considered nearly non-existent. However, Karen's relatives were upset because they had already suffered enough seeing the killer live freely for over 50 years. As for the motive, it remains unknown. The first hearing took place at the end of May, and more details are expected to be revealed only after the trial. According to the main theory reported by journalists, James had feelings for Karen and was jealous of her husband since she married him. Additionally, James was indeed heavily intoxicated that evening, which may have driven him to commit the crime. Karen's relatives expressed their gratitude to the detectives for finally bringing James to justice. However, given his health issues, even if James lives to see prison, he is unlikely to spend much time there. Karen's daughter, who was 57 at the time of James's arrest, said she received the best call of her life when she learned that her mother's killer had finally been caught. She admitted she had lost hope and was surprised that the evidence had been so well preserved. She also revealed that she blames James for her father's early death. Beyond dealing with the brutal murder of his wife, her father had spent the rest of his life almost certain that his close friend was responsible, and it was very hard for him to see James continue to live freely. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video.